let me welcome all the participants to this international roundtable on the rise of illiberalism. My name is Luca Manucci, and I am a researcher at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon. And I'm going to briefly introduce to you today's roundtable, give you some context, some information about our speakers, and then let them speak. I will show you very briefly a presentation. So this is a roundtable that is the continuation of the work we've been doing with The Loop. The Loop is the blog of the ECPR, European Consortium for Political Research. And I'm very glad to be able to have organized and share this beautiful roundtable with great experts and a very large participation. So the series on illiberalism for The Loop, the blog of ECPR, started a bit more than a year ago. I wrote an article for The Loop titled "Back to the Future, Illiberal Democracy Feeds on Fascist Ghosts," where I was taking stock of some trends that I was noticing across the world, processes of illiberal democracy, autocratization, and so on and so forth. And Kate Hawkins and Martin Bull from ECPR, The Loop, asked me to make that article the first of a series on illiberalism, and I was very glad to accept that. Over the course of the time, in this year and 2 months, the series hosted 20 articles, covering a variety of countries. The last ones are Hungary, Sweden, Pakistan, Austria, and so on and so forth, but also hosting really insightful, really helpful theoretical reflections on these topics. So I was really glad when Kate and Martin asked me to organize a roundtable on these topics to understand what has been said in the series so far and to try to understand how to continue it, which ideas are worth pursuing, what topics should we cover with the help of our great speakers. And I also take the opportunity to encourage all the participants and speakers who work on these topics to submit their articles to the blog, to The Loop. I put you here the link, but all you have to do is to go on the website of The Loop and pitch your article there. Today we have 4 speakers. I will not spend much time introducing them, first of all, because I want them to have all the time they need to give their presentations and you to ask your questions at the end. Moreover, they don't need much introduction because these are 4 excellent established scholars who I'm certain you are familiar with, and I will just give you the Twitter handle so that you can see all the awards they've won, the books they've written, and the contributions to the field that they've done. Unfortunately, we were expecting 6 speakers today, but Vanessa Bose from Bidem got sick and couldn't come, and Ruth Benguiat had a very last-minute emergency, and she apologizes, but she won't make it. Nonetheless, we have a great list of speakers today. We have Andrea Pető from the Central European University in Vienna and Budapest, Marlene Laruelle from the George Washington University, Yuko Sato, a postdoctoral fellow at the Videm Institute and University of Gothenburg, and Laura Gamboa, assistant professor in political science from the University of Utah. Last but not least, I want to show you a little bit along what lines we are going to discuss in this roundtable. Let's say that there are 3 principal research questions or axes of reflection that I wanted to explore. The first is, how can we make sense of the processes of autocratization across the world? How do they happen? What pattern do they follow? And so on and so forth. Second, we will look at the causes and consequences of these illiberal tendencies. Under which conditions do these tendencies become more strong and more successful or fail? And what consequences for democracies can they have? And finally, the third line of ideas we're following is what strategies can we adopt to combat autocratization? Therefore, how can we foster democratic resilience? How can we resist autocratization? because I believe it is extremely important to diagnose the malaise, to diagnose what is wrong, but it is also extremely important to suggest a cure, to suggest ways of dealing with this problem. So I don't think that just understanding the problem can suffice. We also have to explore ways of dealing with this problem. And before I leave you to the speakers, just one last thing. The presentations will last approximately 15 minutes each. And all those who are attending will be able to ask questions through the Q&A button that you see in your screen. I will then in the end combine or select some of them for our last 20-30 minutes of a Q&A session. So from my side, this is all. And I let the floor to Marlene Laruelle. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Marlene, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Luca, for this invitation. It's great to see everybody and to be with such a great group of colleagues. I will be launching the discussion with some kind of broad conceptual elements about what do we mean when we use illiberalism. And as you will see, it's a very open field or subfield, and I think we are still lacking a kind of consensual definition on how we want to use the term, both as an adjective, illiberal, and even more if we want to use it as a noun, illiberalism. For me, what is interesting is that it's a contribution, it's a kind of conceptual contribution that is not covered by the other concept we are used to have, like populism, nationalism, conservatism, far right. It's, of course, it's sometimes overlap, but it can create a specific subfield. And for me, what is important, and you will see that in the discussion we will have today, we maybe not will all agree, but for me, it's not about regime type. Regime type is only one side of the broad discussion of illiberalism. For me, what makes illiberalism so interesting is that it's telling us that the enemy is liberalism. So it's clearly staged liberalism as the main problem. And therefore, it's kind of forces us to look at liberalism and not at democracy or democratic institution. So for me, liberalism, it's more about the political philosophy that make us all living together or not living together, more than it is about democratic institution and their erosion. I think that's part of the debates, but I think illiberalism is broader than the debates about democratic institutions. So the way I try to look at it is to have a kind of holistic approach. I think times and space matter. You have a real regional differences that are important to take into consideration, even if it seems to be a really worldwide phenomenon that we have in the broader North and in the global South. And then you have time plays a role also. I use illiberalism only to describe contemporary period, like from the last 30 years, but you have scholars who will tell you we should use illiberalism on a broader historical scale and go back more like to interwar period, potentially to 19th century. For me, the way I try to look at it is I say it's an ideological family with different branches, right? So they may have different conceptual genealogy, references, different sensibilities, depending on the timing, the country, but they all share something. And what they are trying to share is that there is an issue with liberalism. And they sometimes say it, or we can interpret it as there is a gap between liberalism as it looks on the paper, the kind of ideal type of liberalism, and the reality of the world in which we live. Or you have more clear opinion saying like liberalism, the paper or the real version are wrong and we don't want to live in that kind of world. So the way I'm trying to look at that is to look at the different elements that make this kind of huge portfolio of illiberalism. And I think the literature has been unequal on that. You have illiberal leaders who have captured the state and then crafted an illiberal regime. Probably Orban is the most famous of them. Putin was also one. I don't know if we can consider that it's still illiberal. Then we will have a lot of discussion on the continuum. But let's say the example of Orban. where it can begin as a democratically elected leader, but the more the leader is staying in power, the more the regimes is becoming illiberal. And at that time, indeed, democratic institution got attacked, and then we can discuss the kind of the democratic erosion aspect. A second layer is that you have a liberal political leader that are functioning in a democratic, liberal, pluralistic system. They can be sometime in power in government coalition, and sometimes they are not. Think about Austria. Think about Italy with Salvini. We will see how it will be going with Meloni. Think about the US and the Trump legacy, right? So they come in power, they destabilize the system, the liberal system as it is, and then they leave, and then the liberal system function more or less as liberal with some legacies, but it's still there, right? So you don't necessarily have a structural changes of the political, the institutional system. And then something that I think hasn't been studied enough is that you have pockets of illiberal policies inside liberal governments. If we look at our policies toward refugees, toward migrants, policies toward counter-terrorism, all the relationship between what is the protection of privacy, what is the collective security aspect, I think there are natural, normal tension inside a liberal regime, not to become illiberal on some aspect where the government or the population feel like the collective body of the nation is in kind of danger. And I think the pandemics show a lot of this tension that we had even in liberal societies about the moment where there is the society is calling for more protective measure that can be partly liberal. And then what I think has been largely understudied is the grassroots demands. I think there are segments of the population who wants genuinely illiberal solution. They are not brainwashed by propaganda. They genuinely feel that they are not functioning well in a system that would be too open, too inclusive, too pluralistic, too universalistic, as, I mean, there are different ways of looking at it, and who call for more security, more kind of identity retreat, more almost a cognitive aspect of illiberalism where you want to feel, you know, cozy in your own identity. And I think cognitive science and psychology are bringing a lot of really important elements in a discussion that is usually political science oriented about this kind of, you know, being a liberal, being open to differences and plurality. You need a cognitive process to make it, right? I think there are moments for societies or for group of the population for whom it's difficult to make that, and for whom it makes sense to, on the contrary, call for order, hierarchy, exclusion of some groups, a kind of restrictive identity. And I think we should take that into consideration. What I like also with the notion of illiberalism is that it's helping us looking at the systemic issues of many of our societies. I think I think it's important to have that discussion because, as Luca was saying, we don't want only to look at the grievances, but also to look at where can be the solutions. And to find solutions, we need to recognize where we have failure of the liberal order as we have it concretely. And I think we do have failure in terms of equality or equity in our societies. We have social economic grievances that are legitimate. And I think it's important to dissociate the legitimacy of some grassroots grievances and the opportunistic use made by them by illiberal leaders. And if the literature is too much about illiberal leader and their opportunism, we miss the genuine grievance aspect that needs to be addressed. I think we have a conflation of political liberalism and economic neoliberalism that is a danger, that is seen as a danger for a large part of the population that has been feeding illiberalism, and I think that needed to be addressed. If you look from the global south, you have a geopolitical liberalism that is interpreted as a kind of liberal imperialism and a kind of inequality legacy from the north and the south that also need to be addressed, because otherwise it's feeding illiberal narratives. I think we live in a media ecosystem, and not only, I'm not talking only about social media, but globally about television and newspaper that is economically based and funding itself on creating elements that are dividing us and not elements that are unifying us. I think that's the way that I think that genuinely, structurally, the media ecosystem is producing illiberalism because it's accelerating the disappearance of the feeling of a collective good. And that needs to be addressed also, because I don't know how you disentangle the commercial, the kind of clickbait aspect of our media ecosystem. We live in a system where time is accelerating, everything is to be done immediately, and we are invited to become immediately oriented or immediacy oriented citizen. And at the same time, democracy is slow. And to be democratic, institutions have to be slow because you need time to create a discussion. So how do we address this key kind of contradiction that we have inside our liberal system? And last point, I think there is a contradiction between a global economic system that is asking us to be very individualized consumer and a kind of fear coming from the liberal regimes and politicians to see politics as conflictual and rebellious. And I think we are now have entered again a time where it's not the new normal for politics is to be conflictual and rebellious, and that's how it will stay. And maybe that's good. Maybe it needs to be like that with all the danger it has, but it's part of the way liberalism will be able to kind of reinvent itself. So I think I'm probably getting out of my time. I will stop here, but you see the kind of holistic approaches, I think, of several disciplines trying to have a broad overview, which is of course also problematic because it also means it's so broad that we are losing some of the consistency that we would like to create for the term illiberalism. And so I think the floor is open for the field to try to decide what is inside the discussion, what is outside the discussion, and trying to always keep our own vision of us, not only as scholar, but as citizen in the political environment we are living, and how we want to be able to keep the policy aspect that we will be discussing later with Laura and accept some legitimate criticism or critical distance toward the system as it is now, to try to see how we can help answering this kind of illiberal push with solution that we would consider as liberal and not illiberal. Thank you so much. I look forward for the discussion.
Marlene was saying that she feels like we are going towards, or we are in a moment of conflict. I think this is a great link to the presentation that Yuko will now give, because she will give us a great overview of how these trends of illiberalism and autocratization have been working across countries and over time, to see where we are at right now, what's the situation, what's the evolution, how we got here. So thank you, Yuko. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So my name is Yuko Sato, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Variety of Democracy Institute in the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And today, based on my latest research at the Biden Institute, I will talk about the state of the world today and the common process that we see in the autocratization, especially focusing on the backsliding democracies. And finally, propose the questions regarding the possible strategies that we can use to combat this autocratization trend. So, in the Biden's Democracy Report in 2022, we have reported that the trend of the democratization and autocratization over time. So here we've defined democratization as a significant improvement in the element of electoral or liberal democracy. On the other hand, autocratization can be defined as a significant decline in the core institutional requisite for the electoral democracy. So this is a graph showing that number of the countries either improving democracy or declining. So during the third wave of democratization in 1990s, we see the highest 72 countries that are democratizing. However, it declined substantially to the 15 countries today. And meanwhile, in the period that we called as the third wave autocratization, roughly starting from 2000, we see the steep increase in the both number of the countries and also the share of the population living in autocratizing countries reached around 36% of the population in 2021. So where do we find major autocratizers? So the countries where the level of democracy declined most substantially. So they are the top 10 autocratizers in these 10 years. Notably, all of these countries are democracy in 10 years ago, 2011. And 7 out of the 10 are now either electoral or closed autocracies. And in addition to that, 6 out of the 10 top autocratizers started its autocratizing process when anti-pluralist or autocratic politicians took over the government. So the electoral success of autocratic leaders plays critical role in the current episode of autocratization. So such anti-pluralist politicians are often at the same time populist, such as former president of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and they gain public support by emphasizing restoring democracies by replacing the corrupt politicians or the political institutions. But once they are elected, and then they have implemented several institutional change that substantially erode the level of democracy afterwards. So in these 10 years, such populist and anti-pluralist regime diffused across the world, and they are not only in the left-wing populist, but also the right-wing populists, such as the leaders include Viktor Orban in Hungary, Donald Trump in US, and Narendra Modi in India. So how they gain public support, and what is the societal consequence of these anti-pluralists in power? So here's again 6 top autocratizers where autocratization started when anti-pluralist was elected. So in this graph, the vertical line indicates the timing that anti-pluralist party came into power. And such electoral success of anti-pluralists is helped by strategies used by political leaders, including polarization and disinformation. So as the level of the polarization goes up, so the black line here, and then anti-pluralist party tend to be elected. And since then, as the left line indicate, the level of the liberal democracy index starts to decline. At the same time, as the blue lines indicate, the disinformation also increase. So this is especially because the government gained from the polarization and disinformation that increase the distrust among citizens and elites, which creates opportunity for autocratic leaders to implement the reforms that allow democratic institutions. And since this is the trend we see in the top 6 autocratizers, we can expect that we might see the similar trend in many more countries in the globe. Sorry. So for the next step in our latest working paper, Institutional Order in Episodes of Autocratization, we have further investigated the common patterns found in all autocratizing democracies since 1900 to 2021, which is presented as a red line in this figure. And in this paper, we systematically analyze institutional order or sequence of decay in democratic institutions specifically. So the autocratization sequence tends to start with the increasing discontent among citizens, and such discontent comes from lacking support for democratic norm, and it helps emergence of anti-democratic mobilization. And to respond to this increase in the violence by such anti-democratic forces, the government is likely to use repression toward the social actors. And then in the second step, such citizens likely to elect anti-pluralists to the legislature. And the increasing polarization between pro and anti-democratic forces in the legislature create more opportunity for extending power of the executive, and it's decline the check and balances among the democratic institutions. And in the final stage, once anti-pluralists get elected as head of the government, such anti-democratic leaders, like Korea or Orban, that engaging in institutional reform, weakening institutional constraints of the power of the or the power of the opposition, and resulted in the final stage of democratic institution or democratic breakdown. So such trend is traced by the decline in the different accountability mechanisms that constrain executives in democratic countries. The theoretical expectations that we would see decline in the diagonal accountability, the executive constraint derived from the social actors such as CSO or medias, and then a decline in horizontal accountability, such as checks and balances from the legislation and judiciary. And finally, we see the decline in the vertical accountability, citizens' ability to constrain the executive by elections will decline. So in a working paper, we used BIDEM's newly developed dataset, which called Episode of Regime Transformation Dataset, and extracted all 69 autocratization episodes between 1900 to 2021, and then examine in what order different aspects of accountability mechanisms that constrain the executive decline. And here we use the pairwise domination analysis, the method to explore the temporal relationship between ordinal variables based on the BIDEM's accountability indices and indicators. So I'm happy to talk more about the method and data in the Q&A section, but here I just present some results of our analysis. So this figure indicates the general patterns of institutional decay during the episode of autocratization. So I do not go over to the detail in the method here, but in general, the negative value in the domination score, this is x-axis, generally means aspect of autocratization mechanism and accountability mechanism decline in the later of the process of autocratization, while the positive value indicates aspects of the accountability mechanism decline early process of autocratization. So the figure indicates in average, the institutional decay starts from the decline in the horizontal accountability, and then it's followed by diagonal accountability, and then finally the vertical accountability declines and it's close to once it's close to democratic breakdown. So and this figure further compare the institutional order of autocratization between the episode of eventually experienced democratic breakdown, x-axis, and the cases sustained the democratic regime or survival cases in the y-axis. And so this compared the institutional order in both different cases. And there is a similarity in the institutional order of autocratization in both democratic breakdown and survival cases, as the regression line and the 95% confidence interval shows. But we see a number of the variables outside of the 95% confidence interval, and these variables are the ones that deviate from the common thread. So the color of the variables actually indicate different accountability mechanism here. And the variables above the regression line generally indicate that they decline earlier in the process of the autocratization episodes that did not end up the breakdown. On the other hand, variables below the regression line indicates that the variable decline earlier in the process for the autocratization episodes that eventually break down. Such variables include the executive oversight mechanism, or the legislature capacity, investigation capacity, and also electoral management modes autonomy. So the result indicates that difference in the order of decay may explain the cause of autocratization episode, either the democracy will eventually break down or survival. So to sum up the finding from the analysis, so first we found that institutional order of autocratization follows a common pattern, erosion of horizontal, diagonal, and vertical accountabilities. But if we closely compare the sequence of in the components variables making up accountability indices, we see the episodes that starts its autocratization sequences from the executive oversight, legislatures investigate capacity, and electoral management body autonomy are more likely to result in a democratic breakdown. So this may indicate that the decline in these institutions can be an early warning sign of democracy to break down. So finally, from this analysis, I finally introduced two possible strategies and questions how we can effectively stop autocratization. The first things I want to stress is that as we see from the trend in the top autocratizers, the political leaders increasingly using the polarization and disinformation strategy to strengthen their political support and conduct anti-democratic reforms. To combat this trend, we might need some process of quality control in the information available in the social medias, but at the same time, it's poses a really fundamental question to the liberal democracy because implementing such regulation process, even if it's conducted by third party, might harmful for the freedom of expression. So this is an important discussion that I don't have the answer to it, but we have to have a discussion in each society of democracy. And second, there are some common patterns in the institutional decay among the autocratization episode. The early warning sign, a decline in the oversight mechanism and the EMB autonomy can be useful to identify the countries that have a higher risk of democratic breakdown. Moreover, targeting democratic assistance, for instance, to strengthen or defend this institution may have an impact to help sustaining democracy despite this autocratization trend. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the questions, comment, and the further discussion at the roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuko. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I just remind all the people in the audience that they can use the Q&A button to already write down their questions. We can collect them. And then in the end, we have 25-30 minutes of discussion and Q&A. I leave now the floor to a scholar, Andrea Pető, who's been at the very center of an autocratizing process. She's professor at the CEU, Central European University, and I'm sure she has a lot to say. Please, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luca. Can you hear me well? Fantastic. I'm sorry for being late, but I saved Luca from getting a heart attack. Why I did not show up? Because I had a class, and this was a Civica class on gendering illiberalism. And last week we had the honor having Marlene Laruelle as a guest speaker, and we had this vivid discussion of the talk. And so sorry for being late, but I'm here, and but you cannot say no to students. And when Luca invited me, he asked me to focus on the strategies. What can we do? Because I suppose that you know, the ECPR is full of fantastic political scientists who are making typologies, measuring, and saying this is bad and this was bad before and it will get worse. So I would, my task, I think, here is to try to be a little bit more cautious about this kind of methodology. And I would like to already point out two strategies. One is to invite colleagues to your class, like I did with Marlene, and I was so happy that she accepted it, which is, you know, uniting our resources and our forces. And the second one is that take every class and every discussion seriously, that no matter, I knew that Luca is probably pretending not to have a heart attack, but I actually prioritize talking to the students. So this is already a strategy. So in my 10 minutes, what I would like to do is I would like to suggest a theoretical framework and put some readings in the chat. And then I would like to list possible strategies. And since this is for the ECPR, I would focus on what you can do. You yourself, because it's easy to, you know, talk about what other parties and politicians can do, but, you know, the question is what academics and you tenured or precarious workers can do. So And as Luca pointed out, I'm actually the representative of 3 lost fights. So the lost fight of Central European University being forced from one European Union country to another. And no matter that, Yuko's presentation, there was a fantastic ideal state that how it should be monitored and whatever, we lost that fight. A punto, right? So this fight is lost. Also, gender studies master's program had been deleted from the accredited study list. We lost, right? And the third is that I had to resign from the Hungarian Accreditation Committee because of different reasons. One of them is that this article, which I will put in the chat, which is a fantastic history of science journal, I published a peer-reviewed article, and the president of the Hungarian Accreditation Committee wanted me to withdraw this article. So what the heck is happening here, and what can we do? And as I said, I lost 3 fights already, and I'm still young, so many fights to lose. But what can you do? And first, to understand why this is happening, and in order to understand why we are in the middle of this socializational fight, to be in this Gramscian term, you have to understand that higher education matters, knowledge production matters. And no matter that if you are going to have a coffee with friends in a ECPR Congress in a break, everybody's complaining. So, but this matters, and the illiberal forces recognize that how important it is, and what is the importance of this controlling this knowledge production. So I would like to post another article in the chat where we are actually talking about how the illiberal state, what is the modus operandi of the illiberal state. And in this article with Weronika Grzebelska, we identified 3 strategies. One is the fear, constructing fear. The other one is familialism, basically denying women from the right for intellectual work. And the third one is creating parallel institutions. And this is where I would like to talk a little bit about what can you do and what you should be doing. Because these illiberal states are funding different universities and research institutions and NGOs, which are not only the sites of alternative knowledge production, but they are also the sites of academic authorization. And this is an important intellectual, political, and strategic fight. What can you do when somebody is knocking on your door saying that I have got some million euros in my bag? What will you do? Will you join me for this project? And in this cash-ridden, cash-hungry neoliberal higher education where we are all working, this kind of temptation is extremely high, especially for the university administrators. So till this 3 minutes, I was talking about why higher education matters, what are the possibilities and theoretical frameworks, understanding how illiberal states are operating and instrumentalizing, hijacking, appropriating higher education, and why your work matters and what you are doing matters. And in the remaining 3 minutes, I would like to give some strategies, what to do and how to fight this illiberal attack. And if you think that your institutions will be an exemption because this is happening in faraway countries you know so little, you are mistaken, because this in step by step is creeping in your desk, in your classroom, and in your institution. Maybe not the whole full package what Hungary or Russia has, but some elements are already there, and some elements are already influencing what you are allowed to think, what you are allowed to publish, and what you are allowed to cooperate with whom you are allowed to cooperate with. So my strategies is like inviting smart women like Marlene and think together. And I'm really happy that, we have this chance to talk again publicly and, sharing ideas. also taking every minute with students very seriously. And also because, as Marlene said, this illiberal regime works with conflicts, with securitization. Therefore, I'm trying to be nice and trying to do dialogue with all those whom it is possible. And I have to say, I'm very often losing this, but there is no other option to this polarization but trying to understand and bring these different forces together. And if you are just making this statement that this is polarized, and then what is the next step? Of course, we know that these are people who are thinking differently, but the question is, how can you create ideas which are actually appealing for those who are at the other side of the trench? How to recognize that there is no trench in so many important issues. So that would be my third suggestion, not to be satisfied with saying that, oh, this is unbearable, they are impossible. Let's try to think about issues and questions which are actually bridging these issues. And if you have got concrete questions, I can tell you examples where I think I succeeded and some examples where I failed. The next strategy is thinking about better stories. So these better stories is this fantastic book by Dina Georgis, who is actually saying that the loss, the trauma, the death, the depression, the deprivation, the feeling of being oppressed can be a source of better stories. But she's using this concept of better stories not as a teleological concept that good, better, the best. And it is also not a normative concept that there are better stories and worse stories, but she's using as a method of storytelling. And I'm sorry for all those quantitative researchers. I mean, I'm talking about you yourself. What can you do? So these better stories is also a kind of empowering stories, that what can you learn from your losses? What can you learn from grieving? What can you learn from this feeling that we are losing the monopoly, the grip over certain issues like family, like politics, like social welfare? So deeply understanding the issue that we have lost, and then try to learn and to create better stories and better narratives. So this is what I wanted to tell you, that you are the agents of change. Of course, you should publish peer-reviewed articles which are read by 23 people. But besides that, you might also want to think about what can you do when you are discussing these issues with students, because you are talking about difficult, and you are discussing and giving talks about important issues. Like, I could not get out from the classroom at 5, right? Because the students were interested. The student interest is there. And it is your responsibility as a teacher, as a public intellectual, to somehow give better stories and not to fuel this culture and narrative of despair and grim stories, because exactly that's what the liberal regime wants you to do. So resist. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Andrea. I would have listened to you talking all afternoon. And I really like this idea of losing together to then create better narratives. I find it brilliant. Could you, by the way, please put in the chat also the link to the book you mentioned about better stories? So now we are moving towards our last presenter of the day, Laura Gamboa. She will try to lift our spirits a little bit, presenting her forthcoming book on how to resist autocratization. So Laura, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Luca, for the invitation, and everybody else in this panel. As you were presenting, I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be awesome, because I touch on so many points that you touch throughout. Today, I'm going to present a very, very short summary of my forthcoming book, Resisting Backsliding: Opposition Strategies Against the Erosion of Democracy, and I hope you find it thought-provoking. So in the past 2 decades, and this is, the theme of this panel, we have seen the rise of these executives with hegemonic aspirations that have used and abused institution and institutional reform in order to undermine democracy. Some of these presidents, like Hugo Chavez, have successfully transformed these countries into competitive authoritarian regimes. Others, like Álvaro Uribe in Colombia, where I am originally from, despite similar circumstances, have not been able to do the same. And the question the book tries to answer is why. Why is it some presidents successfully erode democracy while others fail? In order to answer this question, I look at two stages. The first stage is kind of what Marlene was talking about, and is what brings these presidents to power to begin with, right? Like, what are the conditions that increase the likelihood that potential autocrats attain power? The second stage looks at the mechanisms that explain why, once in office, some of these executives successfully erode democracy and others do not. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about the second stage, but I have tons of extra slides if anybody has questions about the first one. So I argue that the strategies the opposition uses and the goals they use for are key to understand why some executives successfully erode democracies while others fail. And this is kind of how I develop my argument. I start by defining the erosion of democracy as a type of regime transition that happens over time. Like traditional democratic breakdowns, military or civilian coups, the erosion of democracy pushes the regime outside the democratic camp into the authoritarian camp. So in that sense, it's different from concepts like authorization or backsliding. Unlike civilian or military coups, however, the erosion of democracy happens over time. And I think this has important theoretical implications. Because the erosion of democracy happens over time, because it takes years for an executive to fully undermine checks and balances, aka horizontal accountability, to a point in which they also undermine vertical accountability. That is, they skew the playing field to such an extent that it becomes almost impossible to defeat the incumbent. Because it takes so much time, the opposition has ample opportunities to fight back. And understanding how they do so, I think, is key to understand the erosion of democracy. So let me show you how these oppositions look like. I believe oppositions have two types of goals. Radical goals are oppositions that seek to oust the incumbent before the end of her constitutional term. Moderate goals seek to stop specific anti-democratic reforms. To achieve these goals, the opposition can use institutional strategies, Congress, courts, elections, or extra-institutional strategies, meaning anything outside Congress, courts, or elections. We're talking about coups, boycotts, strikes, you name it. This is how the combination looks like. Institutional strategies with moderate goals would be electioneering, legislating, lobbying, litigation. This is just kind of your normal politics. Institutional strategies with radical goals would be things like recall referendums and impeachments that use institutions to oust the incumbent. Extra-institutional strategies with radical goals could be coups and guerrilla warfare that seek to oust the incumbent outside institutions, but they could also be protests, boycotts, and strikes that seek to push the president to resign. Now, protests, boycotts, and strikes could also be extra-institutional strategies with moderate goals if they're not seeking to oust the incumbent, but rather stopping a particular power grab. Now, individually, neither strategies nor goals are particularly dangerous for democracies. Together, however, I think they have serious consequences for regime change. Institutional strategies with moderate goals pose a small challenge to the government. They reduce the stake of the situations and they convey an implicit acceptance of proper channels of conflict resolution. In this sense, these tactics and goals decrease incentives to repress, as well as the cost of and increase the cost of doing so. Not only are they less threatening to the ruling elite, but they deprive the executive from the legitimate reasons that she needs to remove opposition leaders from office, prosecute, or jail them, as well as her ability to rally around the flag to push for more aggressive anti-democratic results. In this sense, institutional strategies with moderate goals are very well suited to protect democracy. To the extent that the executive wants to keep democratic facade, and that's a big if, and I'm happy to explain exceptions to this case, these tactics allow the opposition to keep its seats in Congress and other institutions, and with them protect courts and oversight agencies that they can later use to delay, modify, or even stop more aggressive anti-democratic reforms. The opposite is true with extra-institutional strategies with radical goals. This combination of strategies and goals poses a major challenge to the government. Not only do these strategies convey a rejection of the established mechanisms to seek conflict resolution, but this kind of goals create a zero-sum game that unites the government and leaves very little space to negotiate. In this sense, extra-institutional strategies with radical goals increase incentives to repress and reduce the cost of doing so. By the time the executive introduces the first set of reforms, it's kind of a stages autocratization that Yuko was talking about, the country is still democratic. Using extra-institutional strategies to oust the president will be seen as unwarranted domestically and abroad. These strategies will therefore not only corner the executive, incentivizing more aggressive anti-democratic reforms, but will also give her legitimate reasons to remove opposition leaders from office, prosecute, or jail them. In this sense, extra-institutional strategies are a very risky gamble for democracy. If the opposition uses these strategies, the government has legitimate reasons to remove opposition members from office, prosecute, or jail them, as well as incentives and arguments to rally around the flag to push for more aggressive anti-democratic reforms that weakened and out of office, the opposition will not be able to stop. Now, institutional strategies with radical goals and extra-institutional strategies with moderate goals sit somewhere in between. Institutional strategies with radical goals increase incentives to repress, but they also increase the cost of doing so. Extra-institutional strategies with moderate goals decrease incentives to repress, but they also decrease of doing so. In this case, these strategies and goals kind of could go either way. Under certain circumstances, recall referendums or impeachments could help the opposition stop the president, or at least decrease her support without significantly increasing the stakes of the situation. In others, however, they can raise the incentives to repress to such an extent that they encourage the president and give her the ability to rally around the flag to push for more aggressive anti-democratic reforms. Similarly, legal, nonviolent, moderate, extra-institutional strategies can help protect democracy by increasing the visibility of the executive, mobilizing voters, or signaling support for democratic institutions. However, illegal or violent, moderate, extra-institutional strategies, which can actually happen very easily without proper training, can harm the opposition's efforts to oppose potential autocrats by enabling the president to crack down on the opposition without losing her democratic facade. So, overall, what I argue is that using institutional strategies with moderate goals and certain kinds of institutional strategies with radical goals or extra-institutional strategies with moderate goals is a safer bet to protect democracy, whereas extra-institutional strategies with radical goals is a more risky bet and more likely to fail. I assess this argument using two cases. The first case is a case of successful democratic erosion, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and the second case is a case of failed erosion, Álvaro Uribe in Colombia. In the book, I also analyze other cases that fit the theory, like Turkey, Poland, and Bolivia, and one case that does not fit the theory, which is Hungary, which I would love to talk about if you have questions. I do process traces in both of these cases, Colombia and Venezuela, using data I gathered during 12 months of fieldwork between 2013 and 2014 with interviews, newspaper archival research, and congressional records. I'm going to give you a story about Venezuela. I'll be happy to talk about Colombia after the Q&A. So, Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999 in the midst of a severe economic crisis, weak governance, all sorts of criticisms about sort of the responsiveness of the government. The opposition to Hugo Chavez was composed originally by political parties, but very quickly it shifted towards business associations, civil society organizations, unions, and later on, media owners and PDVSA managers and members of the board. PDVSA is the oil company in Venezuela. Chavez came to power in a very weak but democratic regime nonetheless, and it took him 6 years to fully transform Venezuela's democracy into a competitive authoritarian regime. The first step in this process was the 1999 Constitutional Assembly. So Hugo Chavez called for a Constitutional Assembly. Because of the way the Constitutional Assembly was elected, he got 95% of the seats. The new constitution gave Chavez a unicameral Congress, increased the presidential term, allowed for an immediate re-election, increased the executive holds over military promotions, and created a legislative commission that ruled with very little restraint for 6 months between 1999 and 2000. Despite these changes, the 1999 Constitution kept a good part of the 1961 Constitution intact, and at least in paper, it has strengthened institutions like the courts. Right after the Constitutional Assembly, and because Chavez called for what he called mega elections, national, regional, and local elections, in order to change the composition of various offices, including Congress. And indeed, he was able to kind of shift the balance of several of these bodies. Even after these elections happened, which is certainly another power grab, the opposition still had 33% of the seats in Congress, a strong presence in PDVSA, sympathizers in the armed forces, and some support in courts and oversight agencies. Once the new Congress was sworn into office, they gave Chavez what they called an enabling law that allowed him to rule by decree in several matters. The enabling law lasted for a year, and Chavez waited the entire year in a classic polarizing strategy in order to produce 49 decrees that threatened property rights and changed important regulations of the oil industry. These decrees were certainly very aggressive, but they did not increase Chavez's hold over state institutions. Yet, after 2001, the opposition still had 48% of the seats in Congress because the decrees had actually split the governing coalition. Strong presence in PDVSA, sympathizers in the armed forces, some support in courts and oversight agencies. And because of the way they were produced and the way they enraged people, they also brought in board media outlets and gave the opposition tons of mobilization resources, which they used. They initially mobilized against the decrees. Eventually, these mobilizations transformed into mobilizations against the government itself. Here's a quote by Pedro Carmona, who was president of one of these business associations, in which he says pretty much, if the government does not give up, we're just going to have to look for a different government. As the mobilizations became more aggressive and the government's discourse became more aggressive and the opposition's discourse became more aggressive, eventually things came out of hand, and one of the mobilization turned into a coup. The coup was very short-lived. On April 11th, there's a massive demonstration in front of the presidential palace. Chavez is forced to resign. In April 12th, Pedro Carmona swears himself into office, closes several democratic institutions. By April 13, the military withdraws its support from the new government and brings Chavez back. As you can imagine, the coup had severe consequences for the opposition. It increased Chavez's support at a key moment in his presidency. It decreased the opposition's international legitimacy. The OEA's invoked Inter-American Democratic Charter, the US, that had initially supported the opposition, had to backtrack their support. But perhaps more seriously, it allowed the government to remove opposition members from key positions. It gave Chavez the legitimacy, the reasons, and the information he needed to replace sort of opposition members with loyalists, particularly in the armed forces. In 2002, 2 generals were charged with rebellion, 2 admirals were charged with rebellion, and 200 officers were dismissed, discharged, or demoted by September 2002. So, in 2002, the opposition had lost sympathizers in the armed forces, but they kept the rest of the resources. Because they felt very strong, they kind of kept strong in the streets. After the coup, the OAS and the Carter Center installed a negotiation table. And the negotiation table was meant to kind of bring the opposition and the government together, but it did not do that. Both groups felt very strong, and they both were trying to use the negotiation table to force the other one to quit or to surrender. With that in mind, in 2002, the opposition called for a general strike, particularly in PDVSA, so they stopped oil production in Venezuela. This strike was initially supposed to last 1 week, but the government felt strong in the streets, and the opposition felt strong in the streets, and they thought that if they continue with the strike, this would translate in the government's fault. So they kept the strike indefinitely. And sure enough, the strike put the government against the wall for a little while, right? Like there was a huge loss of economic goods, national production, goods and services were partially collapsed, people were laid off, small business owners went broke. However, slowly but steadily, the government regained control of the situation. They used the armed forces they now control to put PDVSA back up and running and overcame the food shortages with the help of neighbor countries like Brazil. By mid-January 2003, the strike had failed. As you can imagine, the strike had serious consequences for the opposition. It diminished the opposition domestic support. Here are a couple of information points about this. 76% of the people thought the strike did not fulfill its objective. 64% believed the strike hurt citizens more than it hurt the government, and 52% believed that there were more effective ways to protest. It diminished the opposition's leverage at the OAS and the Carter Center. Before the strike, the opposition actually had a chance to negotiate early elections. After the strike, they could only negotiate a recall referendum. That was what the government had offered all along. And it gave full control over PDVSA, because now they were able to lay off 60% of PDVSA employees under the excuse of the strike and replace them with loyalists and use the PDVSA money to buy support. So by 2003, the opposition had lost 2 important resources, but they still had some other resources they could rely on. After the strike, the opposition was finally able to negotiate a referendum. Chavez was able to use a lot of tools to push the referendum back 1 year. And because he now controlled PDVSA, he was able to use PDVSA resources to win the referendum. In response to that, the opposition decided that the referendum had been fraudulent and called to boycott the 2005 parliamentary elections. As you can imagine, and I'll be very short about this, these also had dire consequences. It hurt the opposition's international legitimacy and gave Chavez 100% Chavista National Assembly. So just to give you a comparison, between 2005 and 2005, it took the opposition 270 days to push, it took the government 270 days to push legislation through Congress. Between 2006 and 2010, it took them 37 days. So just like that, by 2006, the opposition had lost most of its resources. The rest is history. Between 2006 and 2008, the government was able to take over media outlets and other sort of institutions and deepen authoritarianism up to a point in which in 2017, the government stopped being competitive authoritarian and became a fully authoritarian regime. So there are several conclusions in my work. First, the erosion of democracy in Venezuela was far from certain in 1999. The opposition was, in fact, fairly strong. The strategies it used, however, jeopardizes resources and helped Chavez erode democracy. More research on the scope conditions of the theory, as well as the motivations behind opposition strategic choices, is needed, and is kind of what I'm doing next. Thank you so much. I'm sorry it took a little longer.
Thanks, Laura. I said you were coming to lift our spirits. Now I changed my mind. I'm joking. I'm joking. It's a great case study, of course. Chavez in Venezuela is a textbook example of autocratization. I take the opportunity before we go to the Q&A to indeed remember all the people in the audience that they can ask questions through the Q&A button that they can find at the bottom of their screen. I also remind all of you that if you want to pitch your article to the Loop, you can contact the editorial team, go to the website and find all the information, and also that we have Kate Hawkins, one of the people responsible for the Loop, here with us, so you can ask questions also about that. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that Chavez is one of those politicians that for a long time has been described as a populist, and I have nothing against it. Chavez has been using a very populist rhetoric, dividing us and them for a very long time. He's also a textbook example of populism. At the same time, as an Italian who just witnessed the Italian elections, and whoever was on the right was also described as a populist. And again, I don't argue that these people, Meloni, Salvini, Berlusconi, might use a populist rhetoric to gain votes. At the same time, it is not the most salient or relevant characteristic of these political actors. For example, the fact that Chavez was a populist didn't have too much to do with the autocratization process in Venezuela. We can start with the questions. So far, I only see one in the Q&A box, which is for Yuko. And Bettina asks if you can give some example or explaining a bit better the three types of accountability that you described in your presentation: horizontal, diagonal, and vertical accountability.
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. And actually, I responded on the Q&A box as well. But I'm relying on the BIDEM's work and the BIDEM's three accountability indices available in the BIDEM dataset. But first, we classify the different types of the accountability mechanisms found in like democratic system. The first one is about diagonal accountability, which is about like civil societies or the media's capacity to hold government accountable. And the second mechanism is this horizontal accountability, which is more about the check and balances between different democratic institutions. Especially here, I focus on more about the legislature and judiciary's capacity to constrain the executive, because as all the example shows, there was an executive is almost always responsible for this autocratization process in democracies. And finally, the third one is about vertical accountability, which is about the electoral accountability, so the voters' ability to hold government accountable. So it's mostly focusing on the quality of election process. Yep.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We don't have any other questions so far on the Q&A box, but while we wait for someone to write something down, I actually have a question for all of you. I go back to Marlene's presentation at the very beginning, because she made a point that I kept thinking about during the whole debate, which is there are some legitimate positions against some aspects of our liberal democracies. It's not that everything, every time someone complains about an aspect of liberal democracy, then automatically that person is trying to destroy liberal democracy or to bring a dictatorship on. But I wanted to ask you, where do you think is the border between some legitimate grievances that try to improve the system and how to distinguish them from grievances or protests that are actually trying to bring us towards a more autocratic form of government?
That's, of course, a difficult discussion. I think we should each time try to keep in mind if the long-term goal of liberalism are still respected in the criticism, and that would be like believing in universalism and that plurality is good for society, right? And then if you see that challenge, of course, it's still an easy answer because concretely it's not always very clear, but I think in some cases it's very clear that it's going against that. And in that case, you can say it's an illiberal proposal if that doesn't try to target this kind of core element of liberalism to be maintained. And then on some other aspect, you can say, okay, it's a critique of liberalism that still have this kind of long-term vision of both universality and plurality as kind of two core values. And but I recognize it's depending on the context, each case you don't always have a very clear answer. And I think part of the debates you have now is also between what is called post-liberalism and illiberalism, right? You have authors that said that we are in a post-liberal system, meaning that liberalism did a lot to help, progress in human society, but it has kind of reached its limits, and now it needs to be so much reformed that they don't consider it can be called liberalism, which doesn't mean they are illiberal if they consider that liberalism brought progress but arrive at its end. It's still another strategy than to say liberalism is bad in itself, right? So I think, but here also it's more about intellectual debates than it is necessarily. You cannot necessarily easily identify that if you are in a political leader narratives where the speeches are much easier and less elaborated conceptually, right? But I think at the intellectual level you have genuine diverging views on what is happening to liberalism now, and not everything is illiberal.
Right. That's a very good point. Andrea or Laura or Yuko, you want to add something on this?
Yeah, so I'll add a couple of things. First, because the region I study is Latin America, and most of our potential autocrats came from the left, actually, and came in responses to what Sherry Merriman would call excessive technocratic. So sort of liberalism turned into technocratic. We're removing politics out of the government, right? And a lot of this is a response of the existence of the need of representation and better representation, which is easy to sympathize with when you're thinking about Bolivia, right? And how the indigenous community has been systematically excluded, right? It's less easy to sympathize when you're looking at the US and you're thinking about lower income class white Americans that have been just left back by the system, right? But I do think that there is a connection there. These systems have winners and have losers, and the losers are also have legitimate grievances. These grievances, and connecting a little bit with what Andrea was saying, I think one of the ways to deal with this in a classroom is to a certain extent understand where those grievances come from, not necessarily how to address them and whether we should just exclude everybody from politics to advance our agendas, but rather the grievances are legit. Right? What the government might be doing might not, but the grievances are legit, and we should kind of identify those.
Brilliant. And I asked Andrea to reply as you wanted to, plus incorporate a question you got in the meantime, if you can, which is, could you please elaborate on your point that illiberal actors recognize that higher education is very important? We indeed have seen in Hungary a very fast overhaul of the sector, but in Poland, the government has not been as active in that regard.
Thanks a lot. So I think this is a really important question, that what kind of criticism and where does this criticism come from, and also what kind of vocabulary is being used. So being a gender studies scholar, I mean, this is as the German would say, the snow from yesterday, in a sense that this debate has been going on in the gender studies field for 20 years, because it's pretty obvious that neoliberalism and the fateful alliance of some feminists with neoliberalism brought lots of problems. And I strongly agree with Marlene that the question is what kind of alternatives are there and where does this alternative coming from? And again, going back to the point of polarization. So is this really are there really two camps there, or there is a so-called third way, and I'm very cautious using this concept of third way, or are there other forms of state which can actually counteract this kind of takeover by the liberals, and where does this language come from? And we will see very soon how this is working or not working in the case of Sweden. In the coming 4 years will be really interesting to see the resilience and the different traditions of resistance to illiberal tendencies, which are fueled and transmitted by international actors to Sweden. So my point was basically that the question is what kind of vocabulary we are using and what kind of historical trajectory in that particular context. And here I have this anonymous question, and I have to disagree with 2 points. That in Hungary it was very fast. It was not. It was left till the last moment. And it is still going on, the takeover of the higher education, and the Polish government has been very active. But the difference to implement this illiberal context, just think about the starting and the founding of different historical research institutes, and also Warsaw hosts the alternative higher educational institution to the Central European University, which is the new Central European University, which is founded by the Ordo Iuris and which is funded by the European taxpayers, and also the Harvard representatives were at the opening because, of course, they should be there. So, in a sense, this is already happening in Poland, and in Hungary, it is happening in this brutal way because they recognize that higher education is not only an important space for knowledge production. And I only pointed out this characteristic of the higher education in my speech. But there is another element of higher education, that this is a good business. It's a fantastic business which can give some monthly salary for the loyal supporters. And also the different estates and buildings and the offices can be used for enriching the loyal supporters. So in that sense, the foundation story of the Matthias Corvinus college is a good story because it became richer than the University of Oxford when they transferred all this money and estates and hotel resorts and whatever to this particular conglomerate, which looks like a university, it acts like a university, but it is not a university. And that's why it's really the higher education is really important, because of the knowledge production, because of the redistribution of wealth, and because of hijacking academic authorization. So if you look at the web page of this particular institution, and I will put it in the chat afterwards, you see that everybody is a professor, doctor, professor, doctor, professor. So in a sense that this still has this, the higher education still has this aura of trust and the aura of having this kind of independent, objective knowledge. And that's why it needs to be hijacked, instrumentalized, and used. But there's a big difference between Poland and Hungary, that the president of the Polish Academy of Sciences actually gave a very important interview. And he pointed out how this very conservative, very hierarchical, very masculinist Polish science actually managed to resist to the illiberal forces, because it is hierarchical, it is feudal, and very masculinist, and it has got this feeling of guilt. And they managed to, with the sign that this is objective science, they managed to prevent the illiberals in Poland to found a new alternative Academy of Sciences, because that was the threat. So in a sense, I would like to invite us to think, if we are looking at the spaces of resistance, you might not have thought about that these 70 plus Polish male academics would be a very important resource for resistance against illiberal takeover, but they are. So that's also a message I would like to convey, that think about kind of unusual alliances in that particular context to think and to act together against illiberal takeover. And I will put these 2 links in the chat. And thanks for the question.
Thank you. Very interesting. I would like to open a small discussion about the media, because we received 2 questions for Yuko. One is within your dimensions of accountability, where do you put the media? And also, how do you deal with the fact that in democratic erosion, the media, which are critical of the regime, are the first in being attacked? Also, how do you measure disinformation?
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, the media is clearly classified as a diagonal accountability mechanism. So it's like a non-institutional mechanism of accountability. And so how can I answer the second question? From our analysis, we found that the media is critical, or the media bias is declining earlier in the process, and the cases for the democratic survival. So compared with democratic breakdown. So in the cases that eventually survive this autocratization trend, expose that the media's attack in the early process of autocratization. So it might indicate that from the trend that we see from this all the autocratization episodes, it might be less risky, or less threat in the cases that we see the attack on this uninstitutional accountability mechanism compared with institutionalized mechanisms such as legislature or executive oversight mechanism, or judiciary's capacity to constrain. So I just wanted to connect with the discussion that Luca posed about this grievance and the threat to democracy a little bit more. So I was kind of thinking about so the grievance seems to be really we observe in all the autocratization cases in recent episodes of autocratization. So it looks like really the beginning of this all the autocratization trends. But it doesn't mean that it's maybe the Marlene's point that illiberalism is not equal to democratic erosion. So the democratic erosion or institutional decay, it's mostly about the democratic institutions erosion perspective. So in that sense, we probably it's a threat that we see that illiberal trends in the a citizen level, or the attack on the non-institutions, but we still have some room for protect democracy from this illiberal trends. That's maybe the Laruelle's point about how we resist against this autocratization from the opposition parties. It might be the institutional constraints to the executive by the legislature and judiciary. So my point is that a little trend is not immediate threat to the democratic background. So probably we need to think about how we defend democracy. It's really difficult part. Yeah, from that point of view. And sorry, I didn't discuss the second question about measurement on disinformation. So we do have at the Bidham Institute the expert surveys. Based on the expert survey, we do measure the level of the disinformation strategies that is used by the government agent or organizations. So it's kind of very unique data set, which collects the data since 2000 to 2021. So we can compare the trends across the country over time in this 20 years in terms of disinformation.
Thanks, Yuko. Very, very good answer. By the way, I just remembered when Andrea before mentioned that it wasn't such a quick process in Hungary. I was in at the CEU, the Central European University, in 2017, and I remember really massive protests against what the government was doing at the time. And not one, not two, many. There were so many of these very participated, very moving protests, and nonetheless, the worst happened after all. We are moving towards the last 5 minutes of our roundtable, and I would like our speakers to reply to a question that arrived in the box, to which Laura already replied, but I would like an impression from all of you if possible. The question is there potential to address illiberalism through the international domain, like global governance, or is the agenda specifically for the national domain? And I think this is a very important, very crucial aspect. Who wants to start? Maybe Laura, who already replied.
Sure. So my reply is you need both. At the very basic level, you need an international community that has a normative preference for democracy. And I'll give you an example in Latin America. My apologies, that's the region I know best. Nayib Bukele in El Salvador was able to very promptly make huge steps towards eroding democracy, in part because power, the regional power, the regional hegemon, if you want to call it like that, in Latin America, which is the United States, was at the time being governed by Donald Trump. Donald Trump couldn't care less about democracy. What he cared was about immigrants. And Nayib Bukele told him, I keep these immigrants in the country as long as you let me be. And so it happened. And so now we're faced with the situation in which, of course, Nayib Bukele has done a lot more, and reversing that is significantly harder. So at the very basic, you need sort of an international community with a normative preference for democracy that could potentially make the autocrat think twice about what they want to do. More than that, farther than that, you need sort of the international community can provide resources, economic resources, but they can also provide symbolic resources. They can give visibility to these protests and these fights that are happening inside the country. And they can also provide legal resources. So a lot of what the Polish have been doing is uploading some of their complaints to the European Union. And yes, that takes time and is not perfect and all sorts of these other problems. But that serves as an extra barrier to democratic backsliding. And I think that that's useful as well.
Anyone else who wants to reply to this question?
If I can just
Sure.
give an example about international and national. So, I mean, the gender studies has been always this contested field, and because gender is a symbolic glue, therefore, all the when there is an attack on gender studies, you can count on the other attacks to come. So, but the internationalization of these attacks was really obvious, that the certain legal provisions, even some wording, how it was trickling down to the national level, where actually it had an impact. And now what we see is that when this national level has been changed and some countries are being state captured, now they are attacking the international level. So the CEDAW Commission, for example, there is an alternative to the CEDAW Commission, which has been submitted by different countries. So this kind of national and transnational had been very carefully used and instrumentalized by those forces who want to implement an ideological change in the different context. And yeah, and there was a question for me about the question about the West and the East. And I will never forget that roundtable where a Danish colleague from gender studies who was totally shocked that the social democratic Danish government was attacking gender studies was saying that, but these attacks are okay in the East, but here in Denmark, we haven't thought about this. So I just would like to flag the sleepwalking as one of the reasons why these illiberals are so successful, because some of the colleagues they consider themselves as the real good West. They haven't thought that this will actually reach them, and they failed to learn from the experiences and the strategies and the different best practices of those who actually already experienced that, and they survived and loved. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. I would close with the last question we received, then we will wrap it up. I don't know who of you want to answer, but the question says that basically we can understand autocratization in light of economic crisis, imposition of austerity, and so on and so forth. And the question concludes by asking, do you think these economic dynamics are still useful to understand the liberal phenomenon, or is it just a matter of leaders?
I'll go ahead. Only because I hate silent classrooms. I will say that I think it's certainly economic inequality and all of these things are very important. But I would argue that there's an even deeper level to it, which is about representation. It's not necessarily that the economic situation of a country is bad. Like we see that across Latin America, we see that across Africa, right? It's a problem about representation. Is to what extent do I feel represented by these people that claim to represent me, right? And how do we build these linkages? I will say, yeah, also that, of course, yes, if you have like a field of gasoline, you need a match to light it. And these autocrats are just really good at lighting that match. They take underlying grievances and they turn them into this us versus them dynamic. Jennifer McCoy has done excellent work on this, on polarization, and how, you know, like she calls them expert polarizers, are able to use these grievances that are good, that are, you know, like systemic of a country and just exploit them.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura. On this note, I would like to wrap up our roundtable. I would like to thank our discussants, Yuko, Andrea, Laura, and Marlene, and all of you for being here today with us. This video will also be recorded and then uploaded on YouTube for those who couldn't attend in person. And to quote Andrea, well, let's continue the fight. There is a lot of work to do, and let's try to do it together. It was a pleasure to have all of you here today, and I wish you a great day.